The ballroom of Hartwell House had seen many scandals. It had seen a viscount weep into his champagne when his debts were announced over the soup course. It had seen two sisters reach for the same man's hand beneath a dinner table and never speak again. It had seen a countess faint, genuinely faint, not the performative kind, when her husband walked in on the arm of a woman 20 years younger and twice as beautiful. But no one in that glittering, chandelier-dripping room had ever seen anything quite like this. The woman stood near the doorway, still in her traveling cloak, as though she had not planned to stay, as though she had not planned to be seen at all. Her gloves were clean but worn at the knuckles. Her hair was pinned simply, without the elaborate curls that framed every other face in the room. She was not the most beautiful woman present. She was not the most elegantly dressed, nor the most jeweled, nor the most anything that Mayfair society kept careful score of. And yet, every single person near the door stopped talking. Perhaps it was the way she stood, very still, very straight, the way a person stands when they are preparing themselves for something they know is coming and have already decided they will survive. Perhaps it was the way the Duke of Ashford saw her. He was mid-sentence when it happened. Lady Cecily was on his arm, pearl-white and perfect, laughing at something he had said. He turned his head just slightly, the way one turns toward a draft from an open window, and he saw her. The sentence died. His face did something that no one in the room could quite name afterward, when they retold the story over breakfast tables and in parlors across London for weeks to come. It was not surprise exactly. It was not anger exactly. It was the expression of a man who had buried something very carefully, very deeply, and had just watched it climb out of the ground on its own. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the Duke of Ashford straightened his spine, placed his free hand flat against his waistcoat, and said clearly, calmly, loud enough for the nearest dozen guests to hear, "I have never seen this woman before in my life." The room went quiet in that particular way that English drawing rooms go quiet. Not silent, never fully silent, but the music seemed to pull back, the laughter thinned, the glasses paused halfway to lips. The woman did not flinch. She looked at him for a long moment, the way you look at something you once loved and have since learned to grieve, and then she said, very softly, so that only those closest to her caught the words, "As you wish, Your Grace, again." That single word. Again. It fell into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples had not finished spreading before 2 footmen appeared at her elbows, and the Duke had already turned back to Lady Cecily, his smile restored, his champagne raised, his jaw set in a way that dared anyone at all, to ask him what she had meant. Nobody did. Nobody that evening was brave enough. But everybody wondered. Her name was Miriam Voss, and she should not have been at the Hartwell ball. She knew it. She had known it from the moment her employer, Mrs. Adelaide Farnworth, a cheerful, oblivious widow who collected invitations the way other women collected porcelain, had pressed the gold-edged card into her hands and said, "You shall come with me, Miriam, I absolutely insist. I cannot bear to walk in alone, and my niece has cried off again." Miriam had tried gently to decline. She had invented a headache, then a prior engagement, then a vague but serious-sounding obligation that she could not specify. Mrs. Farnworth had waved all 3 aside with the magnificent indifference of a woman who had never been refused anything she truly wanted, and at 8:30 on a cold November evening, Miriam had found herself stepping down from a hired carriage onto the lamplit street outside Hartwell House, her second-best cloak buttoned to the throat, her heart doing something uncomfortable in her chest. She had not known he would be there. That was the truth she would repeat to herself, later, in the small cold room she kept above Mrs. Farnworth's kitchens. "I did not know. I could not have known. I would never have come if I had known." But she had known, hadn't she, in the way that the body sometimes knows things before the mind has the courage to confirm them. She had felt it the moment she stepped through the door, before she had even seen the room properly, before she had removed her cloak or taken a glass from a passing tray. She had felt it in her sternum. A pressure, a wrongness, the particular cold of being somewhere you once belonged and no longer do. She had turned to leave. And then he had seen her. The footmen were polite about it, at least. They did not grab her arms. They simply appeared, one on each side, large and silent and apologetic in the professional way of men paid to be apologetic. And they steered her, very gently, toward a side door that led to a corridor that led, eventually, to the servants' stairs. Miriam walked without resistance. She had done this before, after all. Not here, not in this particular corridor, but the motion was familiar, the quiet removal, the side door, the careful management of a scene that the host did not wish to become a scene. She knew how to be removed from a room without making it worse. It was one of the things she had learned, these past 3 years, in the long education of becoming nobody. The corridor was lit by a single lamp and smelled of beeswax and old wood. One of the footmen, the younger one, she thought, though she did not look at their faces, cleared his throat. "I am sorry, miss," he said. "It is quite all right," she told him. And that, she thought, was the saddest part of it, that she meant it, that she had made her peace with this particular category of humiliation so thoroughly that a young footman's sympathy was enough to make her throat tighten, because it was more kindness than she had expected from the evening. She reached the outer door. Cold air hit her face. She stood on the steps and breathed it in, the November dark, the coal smoke, the distant sound of a horse on cobblestones, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, I should leave London. I should go somewhere he will never be. I should stop existing in the same city as a man who looks through me like glass. She thought it. She had been thinking it for 3 years. She was still in London. Mrs. Farnworth found her 20 minutes later, sitting on a mounting block at the edge of the mews, her cloak pulled tight, staring at nothing in particular. "Miriam, good heavens, there you are. I have been looking everywhere. Are you quite well? You look dreadful, my dear, absolutely dreadful. Was it the heat? The rooms are dreadfully hot. I said so to Lady Hartwell not an hour ago. I said the fires were excessive." "I had some air," Miriam said. "I am well. Shall we go in?" Mrs. Farnworth peered at her with the vague concern of a woman who sensed something was wrong but lacked the conversational precision to identify it. Then she patted Miriam's hand with great warmth and said, of course, though I should warn you, the Duke of Ashford has arrived. Terribly handsome, they all say so. I cannot see it myself. He has one of those faces that looks as though it disapproves of everything, but then I have never understood what women see in." "I know what he looks like," Miriam said quietly. Mrs. Farnworth blinked. Have you met?" Miriam looked up at the lit windows of Hartwell House. Somewhere behind that glass, a man was laughing at something Lady Cecily had said, his smile perfectly calibrated, his hand steady on his champagne, his eyes seeing nothing they did not choose to see. "No," she said, "we have never met." She stood up, smoothed her cloak, and walked back inside. She would regret it later, going back in. Or perhaps she would not. Perhaps she would think, years afterward when the telling of it had worn smooth from repetition, perhaps it was the only brave thing she had done that entire year. Going back through that door, staying in that room, refusing just once to disappear quietly. After all, it was inside that room, that too-hot, chandelier-bright, scandal-hungry room, that everything finally, irrevocably, came undone. All it took was a little girl who had not yet learned to pretend. 3 years earlier, Ashford Manor, Wiltshire, September 1811. The position had been advertised without sentiment. One paragraph in the **Morning Post**, precise and cold as a legal document. Wanted, a nursemaid of good character and quiet disposition for the care of one female child, age 4. References required. Apply to the housekeeper, Ashford Manor, Wiltshire. No correspondence entertained from those lacking serious recommendation. No mention of the child's name. No mention of the mother. No mention of the Duke. Miriam Voss had read the advertisement 3 times at the kitchen table of the Lambeth boarding house, where she had been living for 6 weeks, surviving on what remained of her savings, and the carefully maintained fiction that she was between positions by choice rather than necessity. She had folded the paper precisely along its original crease, set it beside her tea, and thought about it for exactly 1 day. Then she had written her letter of application in her neatest hand, sealed it with plain wax, and told herself it was only a position. A nursemaid, a child, 4 years old. Simple work, honest work, the kind of work that left no room for the past to follow you indoors. She had not thought about who the Duke of Ashford was. She had not thought about what it meant to enter a house still raw with grief. She had not, in short, thought carefully enough. But then, she would reflect later, careful thinking had never once protected her from the things that mattered most. She arrived on a Tuesday. The housekeeper, Mrs. Greer, a narrow-shouldered woman of 50 with the expression of someone permanently braced for disappointment, met her at the servants' entrance and looked her over with the thoroughness of a woman inspecting a bolt of cloth for hidden flaws. "You are younger than I expected," Mrs. Greer said. "I am 23, Miriam said. "I am aware of your age, Miss Voss. I have your letter." Mrs. Greer turned and walked, clearly expecting Miriam to follow. "I meant that you look younger. It is not a compliment. Lady Ashford's last nursemaid was 41 and had raised 7 of her own. The child ate her alive." "The child?" "Lady Lily." Mrs. Greer said the name with a particular softness that sat oddly on her otherwise brisk delivery, the softness of someone who has made an exception they will not admit to. "She is 4 years and 3 months. She has not spoken a full sentence in 5 months. She does not sleep without screaming. She has bitten 2 nursemaids and reduced a third to tears sufficient to fill the ornamental fountain." She paused at the base of the servants' stairs and looked back at Miriam. "His Grace believes the child merely requires firm management. The rest of the staff believe she requires her mother. As her mother is dead, we are at something of an impasse." Miriam said nothing. "Do you still wish to meet her?" Mrs. Greer asked. "Yes," Miriam said. Mrs. Greer studied her for a moment longer, the particular study of a woman who has watched many people arrive at Ashford Manor full of intention and leave depleted of it. And then she gave a single, small nod and continued up the stairs. Lady Lily Ashford was sitting in the middle of the nursery floor, surrounded by the ruins of what had once been a rather fine wooden dollhouse. She had not broken it in anger exactly. It was more systematic than that. The tiny furniture had been arranged in a careful circle around her, chairs, tables, a minuscule 4-poster bed, as though she had emptied the house deliberately, methodically, and was now sitting in the wreckage deciding what came next. She looked up when the door opened. She had her father's coloring, dark hair, pale skin, the same quality of stillness that in an adult read as composure and in a 4-year-old read as something slightly unnerving. Her eyes were very large and very dark, and they moved from Mrs. Greer to Miriam and stayed there. Mrs. Greer said, in the bright, slightly desperate tone of adults performing cheerfulness for children who are not fooled by it, "Lady Lily, this is Miss Voss. She has come to look after you." Lily said nothing. She looked at Miriam with the frank, pitiless assessment that only small children and very old people can get away with, and Miriam, who had been looked at by various children in various nurseries and had learned to meet their gaze steadily, looked back. They considered each other for a long moment. Then Miriam sat down on the floor. Not in a chair, not perched on the edge of the small settee by the window. On the floor, in her good traveling dress, with complete disregard for what it would do to the fabric, and she picked up the tiny nursery table from the circle of furniture and set it quietly in the center, and she waited. Mrs. Greer made a small sound behind her that might have been disapproval, or might have been something else entirely. Lily looked at the table, then at Miriam. Then, very slowly, she picked up two of the tiny chairs and placed them on either side of it. "Breakfast," she said. It was the first word she had spoken in 4 days. "Yes," Miriam agreed. "Shall I pour?" She got the position. This surprised no one more than Mrs. Greer, who had interviewed 11 candidates in 3 months, and turned away 9 of them herself before they reached the nursery door. Something in the way Miriam had sat on that floor, something in the quality of her stillness, the absence of performance, the way she had simply waited rather than reaching and coaxing and trying, had struck the housekeeper as the first genuinely promising thing she had witnessed in the entire miserable business. She showed Miriam to her room, small, clean, north-facing, with a view of the kitchen garden and beyond it, the gray autumn fields of Wiltshire. And she said, with the particular brevity of a woman who says important things quickly so as not to have to repeat them, "His Grace is in residence until November. He does not come to the nursery. If he passes you in the corridor, you are to curtsy and say nothing unless spoken to first. He will not speak to you first. He does not speak to the nursery staff. He does not, as far as anyone on this staff has observed in the past 18 months, speak to anyone he does not absolutely have to." She paused. "He is not a cruel man," she added, and it had the sound of something she had decided to believe through considerable effort. "He is a man in a great deal of pain who has chosen to manage it by feeling as little as possible. You will not take it personally." "I understand," Miriam said. "You say that now." Mrs. Greer moved to leave, then stopped with her hand on the door frame. "One more thing. Lady Lily sometimes asks for her mother in the night. She is 4. She does not fully understand. When she asks," she stopped, started again. "When she asks, do not tell her that her mother is in heaven and watching over her and all the rest of it. She has heard that. It does not help her. Just stay with her. That is all. Just stay." She left without waiting for a response. Miriam stood at the window and looked out at the gray fields for a long time. Just stay. She thought about the letter she carried folded in the inside pocket of her traveling bag, the letter she had not opened in 3 months, her father's handwriting on the outside, the seal still unbroken. She thought about the boarding house in Lambeth. She thought about the version of her life that had existed 12 months ago, before everything had come quietly apart at the seams. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. Just stay, she thought. Surely you can manage that much. She could manage that, it turned out. She could manage Lily, who was difficult and grieving and brilliant in the way that children who have been forced to sit quietly with large emotions sometimes are, who learned to trust slowly, and tested that trust constantly, and one morning, without warning or preamble, climbed into Miriam's lap while she was reading and fell asleep there as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She could manage the nursery, the routine, the careful navigation of a household staff that was kind to her in the cautious way of people who had watched too many nursemaids come and go to invest too heavily in any new one. She could manage, even, the occasional distant sight of the Duke in the corridors, tall, dark-coated, moving with the particular purposeful speed of a man who does not wish to be intercepted, curtsying as instructed, eyes down, presence minimized. She was good, she discovered, at minimizing her presence. She was less good, she also discovered, at the other thing. The thing that happened on a Tuesday evening in October, 6 weeks after she arrived, when she was carrying Lily back from the gardens in the early dark, the child already half asleep against her shoulder, smelling of cold air and grass, and she turned the corner of the upper corridor and walked directly into the Duke of Ashford. He caught her by the elbow to stop her stumbling. She looked up. He looked down. Lily, eyes still closed, tightened her small fist in the fabric of Miriam's cloak and made a contented sound. The Duke's eyes moved from Miriam's face to his daughter's and back again. Something happened in them, something quick and complicated and immediately suppressed, like a candle flame in a draught. He released her elbow. He said nothing. He walked away. Miriam stood in the corridor for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, Lily warm and heavy against her shoulder, her own heartbeat doing something she chose not to examine. And then she carried the child to bed and sang her to sleep and told herself, with great firmness, that it was nothing. It was nothing. It was absolutely nothing at all. The servants, of course, knew better. Servants always do. They noticed the way he began to slow, almost imperceptibly, when he passed the nursery door. They noticed the way he had stopped taking dinner in his study on the evenings that Lily was brought down to the drawing room. They noticed that he had asked Mrs. Greer, casually, in passing, as though it were an afterthought, whether the new nursemaid was settling in satisfactorily. Mrs. Greer had said yes. She had said it with complete neutrality, the way a woman says something when she is being very careful not to say anything else. And she had gone back to her accounts and thought, for the first time in 18 months, that Ashford Manor might yet survive itself. She tried not to hope too hard. She had learned in this house what hoping too hard cost. Ashford Manor, Wiltshire, December 1811, February 1812. It began, as most things begin, with something small. A book. Miriam had developed the habit, in the evenings after Lily was settled, of borrowing from the manor library. She had asked Mrs. Greer's permission the first time, formally, in the manner of someone who understood precisely where the boundaries of her position lay, and had no intention of testing them carelessly. Mrs. Greer had said yes with the slightly surprised expression of someone who had not been asked that particular question before, previous nursemaids, apparently, having shown little interest in Tacitus or the complete philosophical works of John Locke, and Miriam had thereafter spent her evenings in the small chair by her window, reading her way methodically through whatever she could carry back without drawing comment. She had not expected the library to be occupied. It was 9:30 on a Wednesday in December, the rest of the house long since settled, a thin snow falling silently outside the tall windows, when she pushed open the library door and found the Duke of Ashford standing at the far shelf with a book open in his hands, and the expression of a man who had come here for the specific purpose of being alone. They both froze. The fire crackled. Snow tapped against glass. Miriam said, "I beg your pardon, Your Grace, I was not aware." "You have permission to use this library," he said, without looking up from his book. "Mrs. Greer informed me." A pause. "I see," Miriam said. "Thank you." She crossed to the nearest shelf, selected the first volume her hand touched. She would discover later it was a surveying manual for the management of agricultural drainage, a subject in which she had no interest whatsoever, and retreated to the chair nearest the door. Silence settled over the room. It was not, she noticed, an entirely uncomfortable silence. It had the quality of two people who were each pretending the other was not there, which required a certain mutual cooperation, and therefore constituted, in its own strange way, a kind of agreement. She read about drainage. He read whatever he was reading. The fire burned down. After perhaps 40 minutes, he said, without preamble and without looking at her, "That book is upside down." Miriam looked at the page in her hands. It was not upside down. She had simply been holding it at an angle that, from across the room, in firelight, might have suggested. "It is not," she said. A pause. "No," he agreed, "it is not." She looked up. He was looking at the fire, not at her, but there was something at the corner of his mouth that had not been there before, something very small, something that might, in a different man, in a different room, have been the beginning of a smile. He closed his book, set it on the side table, and left without another word. Miriam sat alone in the library for a long time afterward, the drainage manual open in her lap, the fire burning low, trying to identify the feeling that had settled in the room in his absence. She could not quite name it. She thought about it for a very long time. He began to appear. That was the only way she could think of it afterward. He simply began to appear, in the way that weather appears, gradually and then all at once, until you cannot quite remember what the sky looked like before. He appeared in the corridor when she was bringing Lily back from her morning walk, and fell into step beside them without comment, matching his long stride to their slower pace, his hands behind his back, his eyes forward. Lily, who had been wary of him in the way that children are wary of adults who are too careful around them, reached up after a moment and took hold of one of his hands. He looked down at her fingers wrapped around his, as though this were a thing that required careful study. He did not pull away. He appeared in the doorway of the nursery one afternoon when Miriam was teaching Lily her letters, standing with his shoulder against the frame, watching. She did not acknowledge him directly. Instinct told her that acknowledgement would send him away. And so, she continued the lesson. And Lily, who had also spotted him and was now performing slightly for an audience, recited her alphabet with an enthusiasm she did not generally bring to the exercise. When Miriam finally glanced at the doorway, he was gone. But on the floor just inside the threshold, placed there with great precision, was a small wooden box of alphabet tiles, carved, painted, clearly expensive, that had not been there before. Lily found them the next morning, and spent an entire hour arranging them into patterns on the nursery floor. She appeared in the library again on Thursday. He was already there. This time, neither of them pretended the other was not present. The conversations began slowly, the way frozen rivers begin to move in spring, not all at once, not dramatically, but in small cracks and shifts that accumulate until one day you look and realize the ice is gone, and you cannot identify the exact moment it left. They talked about books first, because books were safe, impersonal, contained, requiring no disclosure of anything that mattered. He had opinions, she discovered, that were more interesting than she had expected. He had no patience for sentiment in literature and considerable patience for argument, and he pushed back on her assessments with a directness that was startling after weeks of the careful deference that governed every other interaction in the house. She pushed back in return. He seemed, she thought, slightly surprised by this, and then slightly pleased, and then, after a moment, simply engaged in the way of a man who has been having conversations in his own head for so long that a genuine interlocutor feels like a glass of water after a long thirst. They talked about Lily. This was less safe, but it opened something in him, a careful, cautious pride in his daughter that he clearly did not know what to do with, tangled up as it was with grief and guilt and the helpless bewilderment of a man who understood balance sheets and parliamentary procedure and the management of 3,000 acres, and did not understand, at all, how to sit on the floor of a nursery and simply be present with a small person who needed him. "She is frightened of me," he said one evening. It was not a question. "She was," Miriam said. "She is less so now." "Because of you." "Because of you," Miriam said. "She sees you trying, children see that." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not certain I know how to try," he said, with a frankness that seemed to cost him something. "You are here," Miriam said simply. "That is trying." He looked at the fire for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Her mother found it effortless. The all of it, the being present, the knowing what to do. I watched her and I never understood how she did it." A pause. "I am told grief makes saints of the dead, but she truly was, she was good at it, in a way I am not." "You could learn," Miriam said. "At my age." "You are 31. He looked at her sharply. She realized she had just revealed that she knew his age, which meant she had looked into him, which was. Mrs. Greer mentioned it, she said, which was not entirely a lie. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, not quite warmth, something that lived between them unnamed. "And you," he said, "how old are you, Miss Voss?" 23. "And do you find," he said carefully, as though testing the weight of each word before he placed it, "that 23 is old enough to know what one is doing?" She met his gaze. "Rarely," she said, "but one carries on regardless." The night that changed everything came in February. Miriam woke at 2 in the morning to the sound she had learned over 4 months to distinguish from all other sounds the old house made, the particular quality of Lily's crying, high and thin and frightened, the sound of a child lost in a dream she cannot find her way out of. She was in the nursery in seconds, still in her nightgown, her feet bare on the cold floor, and she found Lily sitting upright in her small bed, eyes open but not quite present, her small chest heaving. "Mama," Lily was saying, "Mama, Mama, Mama." Miriam gathered her up without hesitation. This was routine now, the rhythm of it worn smooth, and held her and rocked her and said the things that helped, the specific words and sounds that 4 months had taught her worked for this particular child, this particular grief. She did not hear the door. She became aware of him gradually, a stillness at the edge of the room, a presence near the doorway, and she looked up and found the Duke of Ashford standing there in his shirt sleeves, his coat evidently pulled on in haste and not buttoned, his dark hair disordered, his face doing the thing it sometimes did in unguarded moments when he thought no one was looking, the thing that was not composure, not the managed stillness of his public self, but something rower and quieter and entirely human. He was watching his daughter. He was watching his daughter, and his face was the face of a man who has been standing outside a room for a very long time and does not know if he is allowed in. Miriam held Lily a little closer and said, very quietly so as not to startle either of them, "She is all right. The dream again. She is almost back." He nodded. He did not move. "You can come in," Miriam said. He crossed the room. He sat on the edge of Lily's bed, carefully, as though unsure of his welcome, and Lily, still half in the dream, turned toward him with the unerring instinct of a child who knows her father's warmth even through sleep, and burrowed against his side. His arm came around her. He sat very still, holding her, and his eyes found Miriam's over the top of his daughter's head, and there was something in them, something open and undefended, something he had not intended to show and could not now take back, and Miriam felt the thing she had been carefully not feeling for 4 months arrive all at once, without permission, without warning, like February light through a window she had forgotten to close. She looked away first. She looked at Lily, sleeping now, her breathing steadied, her small fist curled against her father's shirt. "She does this every week?" he asked. His voice was very low. "Less often than she used to," Miriam said. "She will grow through it. Children do." "Do they?" It was not quite a question. It was the sound of a man asking about something larger than his daughter's nightmares. "Yes," Miriam said, and she meant it for him too, and she thought from the way he exhaled that he understood that she did. They sat on either side of Lily until the child was deeply, peacefully asleep. The candle burned low. The manor settled around them in its old, slow way. Outside, frost crept across the window panes in feathered patterns that would be gone by morning. He stood to leave. At the door he paused. "Miss Voss," he said without turning around. "Yes." A long moment. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." He was gone before she could answer. Miriam sat alone in the nursery for a long time, listening to Lily breathe, her hands folded in her lap, the cold creeping up through the bare soles of her feet, and she thought, Oh, this is going to be very difficult." She was right. And she was wrong. It was not difficult exactly. It was the opposite of difficult. It was the easiest thing, the most natural thing, the thing that felt, in defiance of all reason and propriety and the very firm warnings she issued to herself on a daily basis, like something that had always been true and was only now becoming visible. That was the trouble with it. The difficult things she had learned, you can defend yourself against. It is the easy things that undo you. Ashford Manor in London, March-November 1812. Spring came to Wiltshire the way it always does, reluctantly at first, then all at once, as though the land had been holding its breath and finally decided to exhale. The grounds of Ashford Manor opened up. The kitchen gardens greened. The long avenue of lime trees that ran from the east gate to the house put out their first tentative leaves, and Lily, who had spent the winter largely indoors, discovered the world outside her nursery window with the violent enthusiasm of a child who has been patient long enough. She dragged Miriam everywhere. To the pond to count the ducks, to the walled garden to smell the early roses, to the stables where she had developed a passionate attachment to an elderly gray mare named Compass, who accepted her attentions with the philosophically resignation of very old horses. She narrated everything she saw in the running, breathless commentary of a child who has recently discovered that language can keep up with thought, and Miriam listened and answered and laughed and thought on an almost daily basis that she had never in her life been so content. She thought this carefully, and then immediately thought about something else. Richard, she did not call him Richard. She would never have called him Richard aloud. But he had become Richard in her mind somewhere in February, and she had given up trying to correct it. Richard had also changed with the season. He rode in the mornings now, and sometimes Lily and Miriam were in the park when he returned, and he would pull up his horse and look down at them with an expression that had lost, gradually, its habitual quality of bracing against something. And he would listen to Lily's report of the morning's discoveries with a focused attention that made his daughter glow. He began to join them, occasionally, on their afternoon walks. Then regularly. Then it became, without any explicit arrangement, simply the pattern of the day, the three of them, in the late afternoons, moving through the grounds of the manor while Lily walked between them and talked without ceasing, and occasionally reached up to take a hand on each side, binding them together with the cheerful tyranny of a child who sees no reason why the people she loves should not also love each other. The staff noticed. Nobody said anything. The silence had a particular quality, the careful, collective silence of people who are hoping very hard for something and are afraid that naming it will frighten it away. He kissed her for the first time in the library. Of course it was the library. It was an evening in April, the windows open to the warm dark, the smell of new grass drifting in, and they had been arguing genuinely, happily arguing, the way they had learned to argue, each of them pushing and retreating and pushing again, about whether Richardson's Pamela was a sincere moral document or the most elaborate piece of wish fulfillment in the English language. Miriam had said it was both, which she maintained was not a contradiction. Richard had said that was an evasion dressed up as nuance. She had said that the inability to hold two ideas simultaneously was a limitation she had noticed in men of a certain education. He had looked at her for a long moment with something in his eyes that she had been learning, slowly, to read. And then he had set down his book and crossed the room and kissed her with a directness that was entirely consistent with everything she knew of his character, and entirely inconsistent with everything she had been telling herself for 6 months. She had kissed him back. She was not going to pretend, even to herself, that she had not. What followed was 3 months that she would spend the rest of her life turning over in her hands like a stone worn smooth from handling, examining it, tracing its edges, trying to determine whether it had been real or only something she had wanted so badly that she had mistaken the wanting for the thing itself. It had been real. She was certain of that. He was not a demonstrative man. She had known that from the beginning, had understood that what he showed in private was different in kind from what other men showed publicly, and she had valued it more, not less, for being offered carefully. He told her she was clever before he told her she was beautiful, which she thought said everything necessary about what kind of man he was. He asked her questions and listened to the answers with his whole attention, the way busy people rarely do. He made her laugh, which surprised her. She had not thought in those early months that he knew how. In June, on an evening when Lily was asleep and the house was quiet and the last light was sitting gold and long across the library floor, he had taken her hands in both of his and said, without preamble, in the direct way of a man who has made a decision and sees no reason to obscure it, "I intend to marry you." Not a question, not quite a statement. Something in between an intention declared, a door opened, a hand extended. Miriam had looked at their joined hands for a moment. "That will cause considerable difficulty," she said. "Yes," he agreed, "I am aware. Your family. My mother will disagree. She disagrees with most things I do. I have learned to find it clarifying." Society. Society, he said, with a quiet firmness that she would remember for years, does not sleep in this house or raise my daughter or sit in this library at 10 o'clock at night making me defend my opinions about 18th century literature. Society's preferences are not my primary concern. She had looked at him for a long time. "You mean it," she said. It was not a question either. "I never say things I do not mean," he said. I would have thought 4 months of argument had established that conclusively. She had laughed. He had smiled, the real smile, the one that reached his eyes, the one that she suspected very few people had ever seen. "Yes," she said, "I mean yes." He had lifted her hands to his lips. Outside in the lime avenue, the trees were in full summer leaf, and the evening was warm, and Lily was dreaming whatever 4-year-olds dream when they are safe and loved, and have spent the afternoon doing exactly as they pleased. Miriam had thought, this is it. This is the thing, this is real. She had been right about all three. She had simply not understood yet how little that mattered. The Duchess arrived in September. Helena Ashford, the Dowager Duchess, Richard's mother, came without announcement on a Tuesday morning in a carriage that was considerably grander than the occasion seemed to require, accompanied by 2 maids, a personal secretary, and the particular energy of a woman who has received information she considers actionable. Richard was in London for the week on estate business. Miriam, therefore, met her alone. She was shown into the yellow sitting room, not her usual territory, not the nursery or the library or the back corridors she moved through as a matter of course, and she sat in the chair across from the Duchess and understood, from the first moment, exactly what this was. Helena Ashford was not a cruel woman in the obvious way. She did not shout. She did not sneer. She was perhaps 60, beautifully maintained, with Richard's eyes in a face that had learned, over decades, to reveal only what it chose to reveal. She sat with the perfect posture of a woman who has never once in her life needed to make herself smaller, and she looked at Miriam with an expression of calm, almost clinical appraisal, and she said, "I will not waste your time, Miss Voss. I know what has been happening here. I know my son's intentions, and I am here to explain to you as clearly as I can why you will not allow this to proceed." Miriam folded her hands in her lap. "I am listening," she said. What followed was methodical. Helena laid it out the way a solicitor lays out a case, without heat, without apparent malice, simply with the steady accumulation of facts arranged to produce an inevitable conclusion. Richard's position, the dukedom's requirements, the expectations of his peers, his tenants, his obligations to a title that was not merely his but belonged, in a sense, to everyone who depended on it. The marriage he had been expected to make to someone of appropriate birth, appropriate connection, appropriate social weight, and what happened to titles, to estates, to the futures of those who depended on them when dukes made unsuitable marriages. And then, when Miriam had said nothing through all of it, had simply sat with her hands folded, and her face composed in the way she had learned, in a difficult life, to compose it, Helena reached into the small bag beside her chair and produced a letter. She placed it on the table between them. Miriam recognized it immediately. The handwriting on the outside, the seal still intact. Her father's letter, the one she had carried for over a year without opening, the one she had kept in the inside pocket of her traveling bag, had moved from lodging house to lodging house, had brought with her to Ashford Manor and kept at the bottom of her small chest of drawers, had never been able to make herself open because some part of her had always known that what was inside it would cost her something. "Where did you get that?" Miriam said. "It came out very flat." "That is not important," Helena said. "It is my property." "It was," Helena said. "I have read it. I think you know what it contains." Miriam looked at the letter, at her father's handwriting, at the seal she had never broken. "Tell me," she said quietly. Helena told her. The contents were not, in the end, entirely surprising. Her father, Robert Voss, whom she had grown up believing to be a respectable if unsuccessful merchant of good English stock, had written the letter during an illness 3 years prior, in the manner of a man who wishes to die without certain weights upon his conscience. He had written that he was not, in fact, who he had told her he was. That his own father had been an Irish laborer named Cassidy who had come to England in the 1770s, and had reinvented himself with the thorough efficiency of a man who understands that identity, in England, is largely a matter of performance. That Miriam's mother had known the truth and kept it. That Miriam herself had no English blood worth speaking of on her father's side, no family connections of any standing, and no claim to the modest respectability she had been raised to assume was hers. That she was, by every measure that mattered in 1812, nobody. Helena let the silence hold for a moment. Then she said, "You understand what this means." "I understand what you believe it means," Miriam said. "It means," Helena said with great patience, "that my son, who does not yet know this and who I am prepared to allow to continue not knowing it, provided we reach an understanding today, would be binding his title, his daughter's future, and the futures of every family on 3 estates to a woman with nothing. No birth, no connection, no name that will withstand examination." She paused. "He believes himself in love. I do not doubt his sincerity. But sincerity, Miss Voss, does not pay tenant farmers or maintain the roofs of 500 houses, or negotiate a suitable marriage for a daughter when that daughter comes of age." "And Lily," Miriam said because she could not help it. Something shifted in Helena's expression, briefly, almost imperceptibly. If Miriam had not been watching very carefully, she would have missed it. "Lily," Helena said, "is exactly why you will do this." She let that sit. A duke's daughter raised under the shadow of her father's scandalous second marriage, to a woman of no birth, no standing, no verifiable identity, will find every door closed to her, every school, every connection, every suitable match when the time comes. She straightened infinitesimally. "You love the child. I have been told so by everyone in this house who has an opinion which appears to be everyone in this house. If you love her, you will not do this to her future." Miriam sat very still. She looked at the letter on the table between them. She thought about Lily in the nursery above them, working on her letters, arranging and rearranging the painted wooden tiles into patterns that pleased her, waiting for Miriam to come back upstairs. She thought about Richard in London, not knowing any of this was happening. She thought about the version of the future she had allowed herself, briefly and dangerously, to imagine. "What do you want me to do?" she said. Helena told her. She left that night. She did not pack everything, there was not time, and she did not trust herself to stay in the house long enough to be thorough. She took what she could carry. She left a note for Mrs. Greer, brief, practical, asking her to tell His Grace only that she had gone and giving no reason. She did not leave a note for Richard. She could not find the words, and she did not trust the words she found, and she was afraid that if she wrote anything true, she would not be able to make herself stop. She went to Lily's room last. The child was asleep, deeply and peacefully, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed in the abandoned way of children who sleep without anxiety. The alphabet tiles were arranged on the windowsill in a long, careful line. Miriam had taught her to do this before bed, a counting off of the day, a small ritual of order before sleep. Miriam stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she crossed the room very quietly and pressed her lips to Lily's hair, just once, just briefly, and breathed in the smell of her, grass and soap and the particular warmth of a sleeping child. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, my darling." Lily did not wake. Miriam walked out of Ashford Manor at 11 o'clock at night, her bag in her hand, the November cold settling around her like something she deserved, and she did not look back. She had learned a long time ago that looking back only made it harder. It did not, she discovered, make it impossible to survive. Only very nearly. She carried the letter with her. Helena had left it on the table deliberately, Miriam thought, or perhaps simply because she had already read it, and it had served its purpose and was no longer of use to her. Miriam picked it up as she left the room. She did not open it. She already knew what it said. She carried it anyway, in the inside pocket of her traveling bag, moved it from lodging to lodging, from Mrs. Farnworth's house to the small room above the kitchens, kept it through 3 years of careful not thinking about everything it represented. She did not know then what Helena had done to it. She did not know that the woman who had sat across from her with such measured calm had, before replacing the seal, made one small and devastating addition to her father's words, 4 lines, in a careful imitation of his hand, that changed the letter's meaning entirely. She did not know that the letter she carried was not the letter her father had written. She would not know for 3 more years. And in those 3 years, a great deal would happen that could not be undone. Most of it would be Richard's fault. Some of it would be hers. None of it in the end would be permanent. But permanence, when you are living inside the worst of it, is a very difficult thing to believe in. London and Ashford Manor, November 1812, October 1814. He came home on a Friday. The carriage turned through the east gate in the early afternoon, and Mrs. Greer was waiting at the servants' entrance with the particular stillness of a woman who has been rehearsing a conversation she does not want to have, and Richard knew, before he had descended the carriage steps, before she had said a single word, that something was wrong. He had learned in 31 years to read houses the way sailors read weather, the quality of the quiet, the way the staff moved or did not move, the specific texture of an absence. "Where is Miss Voss?" he said. Mrs. Greer handed him the note. He read it twice. Then he folded it with great precision and put it in his coat pocket and said, "And Lily." "With the kitchen maid, Your Grace. She has been asking." "Asking for Miss Voss?" A pause that told him everything. "Yes," Mrs. Greer said. He nodded. He went inside. He went directly to his study, closed the door, and stood at the window for a long time looking out at the November park, the bare lime trees, the gray sky, the grounds that had been so green in the summer and were now stripped of everything that had made them look like anything other than what they were. He sent inquiries to London that same evening. He found her within a week. It was not difficult. She had not hidden herself. She was simply living in a boarding house in Lambeth and working as a seamstress for a draper on the Borough Road, and he sent a letter, and then another, and then a third. None of them were answered. He considered going himself. He planned it twice, decided against it, planned it again. And then his mother came to London. Helena arrived at his Grosvenor Square house on a Tuesday morning with the unhurried confidence of a woman who has already won an argument and is merely waiting for the other party to realize it. She sat across from her son, and she told him, in her careful, methodical way, that she had spoken to Miss Voss before her departure. That Miss Voss had been made aware of certain information regarding her background. That Miss Voss had, upon receiving this information, accepted a sum of money and agreed to remove herself from the situation permanently. She placed a figure on the table. It was not a small figure. Richard looked at it. Something happened in his chest, a slow, structural thing, like a wall taking a blow it was not built to withstand. He felt it give. He felt something on the other side of it give too. "She took money," he said. "She did," Helena said. "To leave. To leave quietly and without difficulty, which she did. She is a practical woman, Richard. Whatever else she may be, she understood her situation clearly." He sat very still. He thought about the library. He thought about the April evening and the joined hands and the words he had said, "I never say things I do not mean." And he thought about Lily, upstairs right now at Ashford Manor, asking for a woman who had apparently weighed her affection against a banker's figure and found the figure sufficient. "I see," he said. His voice came out entirely level. He was rather proud of that afterward, the levelness, the absence of anything audible in it. "It is for the best," Helena said. "You know it is, in time." "Thank you, Mother," he said. "I think that is sufficient." She recognized the tone. She had heard it perhaps twice in his life, and both times it had meant that the conversation was over and further words would be wasted. She gathered herself and left with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has accomplished what she came to accomplish. Richard sat alone in the room for a very long time. Then he picked up the figure she had left on the table, carried it to the fireplace, and dropped it into the flames. He watched it burn. And he thought, fine then, that is what it was, now I know. It was the most useful lie he had ever told himself. He would tell it every day for 2 years. The man who returned to Ashford Manor for Christmas that year was recognizable as the man who had left it in October, only in the technical sense that he occupied the same body and answered to the same name. The staff felt it immediately. Not cruelty, he was not cruel, had never been cruel, that was not what had changed. It was the absence of something. The quality of warmth that had been building, slowly and tentatively, through the spring and summer, the afternoons in the park, the evenings that had run later than necessary, the smile that had appeared with increasing frequency in the library, all of it gone. Sealed over, as though it had been assessed, found to be a liability and closed. He was polite. He was efficient. He managed his estates and his parliamentary obligations and his household with the focused competence that had always been his defining characteristic, and he did all of it with the particular energy of a man who has decided that work is preferable to thought. Lily understood none of this, of course. Lily was 4 years old and had lost, in the space of 1 week, the only mother she had known. She did not process this with the philosophical resignation of an adult. She processed it with the full force of a small person for whom abandonment is not a concept but a physical reality. A gap where warmth used to be, a silence where a voice used to be, a morning routine that had simply stopped. She stopped eating properly for 3 weeks. She stopped sleeping through the night for 2 months. She asked for Miriam with a persistence that was, in its own way, the bravest thing Richard had ever witnessed. The refusal of a child to accept that love, once given, could simply be withdrawn without explanation. He did not know how to answer her. He tried in his stiff and inadequate way. He sat with her. He read to her badly in the halting voice of a man unused to reading aloud. He brought her things, books, toys, a new doll with proper hair that Lily named *Miri without appearing to notice the significance, or perhaps noticing it perfectly. He told her that Miss Voss had gone away. Lily asked why. He said he did not know. Lily looked at him with her dark eyes, his own eyes in her small face, and said, "Did she stop loving us?" He had not been prepared for that. "No," he said, and was surprised to find that he meant it despite everything. "No, I don't think that was it." "Then why?" He had no answer. It was the first time in his adult life that he had sat with a question he could not resolve by applying sufficient intelligence and resources to it, and found that sitting with it was simply what was required. He sat with it. He did not find an answer. He learned, eventually, to live in the space where the answer should have been. The years moved. 1813 became a matter of management, of estates, of London seasons attended with the minimum necessary engagement, of the careful maintenance of a life that functioned correctly on the outside and had stopped functioning in some essential way on the inside. He was good at the management. He had always been good at the management. He told himself about the money often. He refined the telling of it until it had the smooth, practiced quality of a story told many times. She took the money, she left. That is what she was, that is what it was, and the sooner that is fully understood the better for everyone concerned. He told it to himself at breakfast and at his desk, and in the library in the evenings when the chair by the door sat empty and the fire burned, and the books waited on their shelves with a patience he could not match. He told it to himself, and he believed it, and it worked. It worked the way certain medicines work, imperfectly, with side effects, requiring increasing doses over time to maintain the same effect. By the spring of 1813 he had decided, with the efficient finality of a man closing an account, that he would marry. Not from desire, he had concluded, was an overrated faculty that produced primarily poor decisions, but from practicality. Lily needed a mother. The dukedom needed an heir. He was 32 years old and had, he felt, demonstrated sufficient romantic impracticality for one lifetime. He began attending to Lady Cecily Marsh. Lady Cecily was 24, blonde, the daughter of an earl with impeccable connections and a well-managed fortune. She was accomplished in the ways that mattered socially, decorative in the ways that mattered publicly, and possessed of the careful, polished temperament of a woman who had been raised from birth to occupy exactly this kind of position. She was not unkind. She was not stupid. She was simply, in every essential way, the opposite of everything Miriam Voss had been. And Richard suspected, without examining the thought too closely, that this was not entirely a coincidence. Cecily understood the arrangement. These things were understood without being stated, in the particular manner of their class. She was not expecting passion. She was expecting position, security, and a husband who would be present for the required occasions and absent for the rest. It was a transaction conducted with mutual clarity and no illusions on either side. Richard told himself this was better. He almost believed it. And then in October of 1814, Duchess Helena died. She went quickly, a stroke in the night, without warning, with none of the protracted suffering that might have allowed for the conversations that now would never happen. She was found by her maid in the morning, peacefully arranged, her hands folded, her face composed in the same expression of cool authority it had worn for 60 years. Richard stood at her graveside in the Wiltshire rain, and felt the complicated thing that children feel when they bury a parent they have never fully understood, grief tangled with something that was not quite anger and not quite relief, and not quite anything he had a word for. He went through her effects himself. He did not know why exactly. Helena had always been meticulous. There would be no disorder to manage. But some instinct drove him to do it personally, to look through the papers and letters and small accumulated materials of her careful life with his own hands. He found the letter on the third day. It was in a locked box in her writing desk, in an envelope addressed to no one, and when he opened it, he found inside a single sheet of paper in his mother's handwriting. Not a letter, exactly, more in the nature of a record, the kind a precise and methodical person makes when they want to be certain that what they have done is documented for their own conscience, or perhaps for God, since they have no intention of showing it to anyone else. He read it. He read it again. He sat at his mother's writing desk in the autumn quiet of her London house, and he read it a third time, very slowly, and then he set it down with great care, the way you set down something that has just detonated in your hands, and you are not yet certain of the extent of the damage. His mother had lied. Not about all of it. The letter from Miriam's father had been real. The circumstances of her birth had been real enough in their way. But the figure, the money she had told him Miriam had accepted, had been a fiction. A clean, simple, devastating fiction. Helena had paid Miriam nothing. She had threatened her instead, with Lily, with the child's future, with the specific leverage that a clever woman uses when she understands that money will not be enough. Miriam had not been bought. Miriam had been cornered. And she had sacrificed herself, her future, her happiness, her presence in this house and in this family, for a child who was not even hers, because a cold and brilliant woman had understood, with uncomfortable accuracy, exactly what Miriam loved most and exactly how to use it. Richard sat at the desk for a long time. Outside, London moved around him. Carriages and voices, and the ordinary noise of a city that did not know or care that inside this room a man was sitting very still with the rubble of 2 years of careful, practiced, self-protective belief lying in pieces around him. He had been wrong. He had been profoundly, completely, irreversibly wrong, not just about what Miriam had done, but about what he had done in response to it. Every coldness, every closed door. Every morning he had applied himself to forgetting her with the thoroughness of a man destroying evidence. Every evening he had sat in the library with the chair by the door empty, and had told himself that the emptiness was fine, was correct, was what happened when you made the rational choice. He had been wrong about all of it. The question was whether wrong at this distance was something that could be corrected. He did not know the answer. He found himself, for the first time in 2 years, in the position of a man who does not know the answer and cannot manage his way to one. He found himself thinking about a November ball. He found himself thinking about a woman in a traveling cloak near a doorway, still and straight, and prepared for whatever was coming. He found himself thinking, where is she now? He sent his secretary to find out the next morning. He had an address within a week. He sat on it for 3 weeks drafting letters, burning them, drafting them again, paralyzed in a way he had not been paralyzed since the first days after his wife's death, when action had seemed not just insufficient but obscene. He did not know how to begin. He did not know if beginning was something she would want. And underneath all of it, quieter and more damaging than the rest, was the knowledge of what he had done in the 2 years of not knowing, the coldness, the deliberate erasure, the practiced story he had told himself and others, the way he had looked through people at parties who mentioned her name, the way he had agreed, eventually, to Lady Cecily's attentions with the flat efficiency of a man disposing of a problem. He had been so certain. He had been so relentlessly, self-righteously certain. And while he had been certain, she had been living in a room above someone's kitchens, working for a cheerful widow who did not know her, carrying a letter she had not opened because she did not know it had been corrupted, and believing, he could only imagine she believed, that she had done the right thing and that it had cost her everything, and that this was simply what the right thing sometimes cost. He sat in his study at Grosvenor Square on a Tuesday evening in November, one hand flat on his desk, the other holding an unfinished letter, the fire burning low, and he thought, "She is in this city. She has been in this city for 3 years. And in 3 weeks I will take Lady Cecily Marsh to the Hartwell ball, and I will smile, and I will be everything that is expected of me, and I will be wrong about that too." He set down the letter. He pressed both hands flat on the desk. He closed his eyes. He thought about a February night and a nursery and a child sleeping between two people who had not yet understood what they were to each other, and a voice saying, "You can come in." He had come in. And then he had walked back out and locked the door behind him, and thrown away the key with both hands and called it wisdom. He did not finish the letter that night. He would not finish it for another 2 weeks, and by then it would be too late. The Hartwell ball would be 4 days away. The engagement to Lady Cecily would be 3 weeks from announcement, and all the careful architecture of the life he had built on a lie would be standing, polished and correct and entirely hollow, waiting for something to walk through it. He did not know yet what that something would be. He did not know that it would be small, that it would have dark hair and her father's eyes, and a fistful of another woman's skirt, that it would weigh perhaps 4 stone, that it would say one word, and that one word would be enough. Hartwell House, London, November 1814. Lily had not been meant to attend the ball. Children of 5 did not attend balls, this was understood, had never required discussion. But Lily had developed, over the past year, a habit of small rebellions against the boundaries of the nursery, and on this particular evening, with her father occupied downstairs receiving guests and her new nurse distracted by a vexing letter from her sister, she had simply walked out of the nursery, down 2 flights of stairs, and through a door she was not supposed to open. She told herself she only wanted to see the dresses. She had heard the nursery maids talking about the Hartwell ball for a week, the flowers, the music, the candles, the gowns, and her 5-year-old imagination, fed on the half-understood fragments of adult conversation, had constructed something glittering and impossible that she simply needed to see with her own eyes. She slipped through a side door into the edge of the ballroom. No one noticed her at first. She was small, and the room was full, and a child in a white nightgown at the edge of a crowd is the kind of thing that adults' eyes slide past when they are not specifically looking for it. She stood in the shadow of a large potted fern near the wall and looked at the room with her mouth slightly open. It was, she decided, exactly as glittering and impossible as she had imagined. She was still looking at the chandeliers, at the dancers, at the impossible quantity of candles, when she heard her father's voice. She knew it instantly. She had spent 5 years learning the particular register of it, the way it changed in different rooms, the way it sounded when he was tired or pleased or, as now, doing the careful, controlled thing he did at parties that she did not entirely understand but recognized as a kind of performance. She turned to find him. And that was when she saw her. Lily did not think in that moment about 3 years of separation. She did not think about the explanation she had been given. Miss Voss had to go away, darling. It was for the best. It could not be helped explanations that had never satisfied her, and that she had simply learned to stop questioning aloud because questioning them made the adults around her uncomfortable in a way she did not like to cause. She did not think about any of that. She saw a woman near the doorway in a plain cloak, standing very still, and something in her small body recognized her before her mind had finished processing the recognition. The particular shape of her, the way she held her shoulders, something in the tilt of her head that 5 years of memory, however dimmed, had not fully erased. And in the same instant, she heard her father say, loudly, clearly, in the voice that meant something important was happening, "I have never seen this woman before in my life." Lily did not understand the words as a lie. She understood them as something worse, confirmation. Her father had said the words. Her father did not say things he did not mean. She knew this about him, had absorbed it the way children absorb the fundamental physics of their parents' characters. And so, if her father said he had never seen this woman, then perhaps Lily was wrong. Perhaps it was not her. Perhaps the woman who had sung to her every night for a year, who had taught her her letters with painted wooden tiles, who had once held her through an entire night of fever without sleeping, was simply a stranger who looked like a memory. She watched the footmen begin to move toward the woman. She watched the woman not flinch. She watched her say something quiet that Lily was too far away to hear, and she watched her turn, very calmly, toward the door, as though she had expected exactly this and had already made her peace with it. And something in Lily, something that had been held very still and very careful for 3 years, something that had learned not to ask too many questions, because the answers made the grown-ups around her sad, broke open. "Mama," she said. It came out small at first, a whisper into the noise of the ballroom, lost beneath the orchestra and the laughter and the clink of glasses. She said it again, louder, and this time she was already moving. "Mama." She ran. She ran the way only small children run, without calculation, without grace, with her whole small body thrown forward into the effort of it, her bare feet. She had forgotten her slippers. She had forgotten everything except the singular, overwhelming need to reach the woman by the door, slapping against the marble floor, weaving between skirts and legs and the startled, parting bodies of 200 of London's most fashionable people, all of whom turned as one. To watch a child in a nightgown launch herself across a ballroom. The footmen froze. Miriam turned. And the world for a moment simply stopped. She had perhaps 1 second to prepare herself, and she did not use it for preparation. She used it the way her body had always used such moments, without thought, with pure instinct, and she dropped to her knees on the marble floor, heedless of her dress, heedless of the 200 eyes now fixed upon her, and opened her arms. Lily hit her like something thrown. Her small arms went around Miriam's neck with a fierce, desperate strength that seemed impossible from a body so small, and she buried her face against Miriam's shoulder, and she said the word again, "Mama, Mama, Mama." Not as an announcement now, but as something private, something repeated for its own sake. The way a person repeats a word they have been forbidden to say for so long that saying it finally feels like breathing after held breath. Miriam held her. She held her the way she had held her on that February night 3 years ago, the way she had held her through fevers and nightmares and the long, patient work of teaching a grieving child to trust the world again. And she felt the small body shaking against her, and she felt her own face wet, and she did not, for several long seconds. Think about the 200 people watching, or the orchestra that had faltered into silence, or the man standing rigid in the center of the room, with an expression that no one present would ever fully be able to describe afterward. She simply held her. "I'm here," she whispered into Lily's hair. "I'm here, my darling, I'm here." The room did not move. This was the detail that would be repeated for weeks afterward, in every retelling, that 200 people, the most socially fluent and conversationally agile people in London, had simply stood in complete silence for what felt like a very long time, and watched a small girl in a nightgown sob into the shoulder of a woman the Duke of Ashford had, not 90 seconds earlier, sworn he had never seen in his life. Lady Cecily Marsh stood very still beside the place where Richard had been standing, her hand still extended toward an arm that was no longer offering itself, her face arranging itself slowly into an expression of dawning, horrified comprehension. The orchestra leader, uncertain what else to do, signaled his musicians to stop entirely. And the Duke of Ashford stood in the middle of his own carefully constructed lie, watching his daughter cling to a woman he had just publicly denied knowing, and understood, with the total and devastating clarity of a man whose entire defense has just collapsed in front of every person whose opinion had ever mattered to him, that there was no recovering from this moment by any means available to a gentleman of his standing. There was only the truth. He had been hiding from it for 3 years. It had just run across a ballroom in its bare feet and announced itself to 200 witnesses. He moved before he had decided to move. He crossed the floor, not with the careful, measured stride that governed his every public movement, but quickly, almost stumbling, the way a man moves when calculation has entirely failed him and only instinct remains. And he came to a stop a few feet from where Miriam knelt with his daughter in her arms, and he looked down at the two of them, and for a long moment he could not make himself speak at all. Miriam looked up at him. There was no anger in her face. That was the thing that undid him most completely, not accusation, not triumph, not even the cold composure he might have expected and almost would have preferred, because at least that he could have responded to. There was only a terrible, weary sadness, 3 years deep, the sadness of a woman who has run out of the energy required to be angry at someone and has settled instead into something quieter and more permanent. "Your Grace," she said very softly. It was the same voice she had used at the door 20 minutes earlier. "As you wish, Your Grace," again. But this was not the same. This time her voice broke on the title, very slightly, in a way that told the entire silent room, though only he was close enough to hear it clearly, that the composure she had maintained for 3 years was not infinite. That something in her, too, had finally reached its end. "Miriam," he said. It was the first time he had said her given name aloud in 3 years. It came out of him cracked open, stripped of every careful syllable of formality he had built around himself like armor, and the sound of it seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised everyone listening. Lily lifted her head from Miriam's shoulder. She looked at her father with her dark eyes, his own eyes in her small wet face, and she said, with the brutal, unanswerable clarity that only children possess, "You said you didn't know her." The silence in the room deepened, if such a thing were possible. "You said you'd never seen her," Lily said, her voice rising, the confusion and hurt of 3 years finding, finally, a target. "But you knew her. You knew her the whole time. Why did you say that? Why did you make her go away?" Richard looked at his daughter. He looked at Miriam, still on her knees on the marble floor, holding his child, her face turned up to his with an expression he could not yet bring himself to fully read. He looked briefly at the 200 faces around the edges of the room, Lady Cecily's among them, white and rigid, and already, he understood, lost to him, though he found he could summon very little feeling about that fact at all. And he understood that there was a choice in front of him that he had been avoiding for 3 years, dressed up in different clothes each time it had presented itself. At his mother's writing desk with the letter in his hands, in his study with unfinished drafts piling in the drawer, in this very room 20 minutes ago when the easiest thing, the practiced thing, the thing his pride had reached for instinctively, had been denial. He could keep denying. Or he could, for the first time in 3 years, tell the truth, in front of everyone, regardless of what it cost him. He knelt down. He knelt on the marble floor of Hartwell House, in front of 200 witnesses, in his evening clothes, beside the woman he had once asked to marry him, and the daughter who had just exposed every lie he had told to survive losing her. And he said, in a voice that carried to every corner of the silent room, "I lied. I have known this woman for 3 years. I asked her to marry me. I let her go because I believed something about her that was not true, and even after I learned it was not true, I was too much of a coward to come and tell her so." He looked at Miriam. "I am telling her now, in front of all of you, because she has spent 3 years paying for my cowardice in private, and I will not let her pay for it in private any longer." The room did not breathe. Miriam stared at him. "Richard," she started. "Let me finish," he said, and something in his voice, raw, urgent, entirely without its usual armor, made her stop. "My mother lied to both of us. She told you things about your birth meant to frighten you away, and some of what she told you may even have been true, though I have learned since that the worst of it was forged in her own hand. And she told me you had taken money to leave, that you had simply been bought like a transaction. And I was such a fool, such a proud and wounded fool, that I believed her instantly, because believing her was easier than believing that I might have failed you." He reached for her hand. She let him take it. "You did not take money," he said. "You took nothing. You gave up everything, me, this child, the only home you had found in years, because my mother threatened Lily's future, and you decided, without a moment's hesitation, that her future mattered more than your own happiness." His voice cracked. "I have spent 3 years being angry at a woman who does not exist. The real one knelt on a ballroom floor 20 minutes ago and held my daughter without a second's thought for her own dignity, because that is who she has always been, and I was too blind and too proud to see it even when it was standing directly in front of me." Lily, still held against Miriam's shoulder, looked between the two adults with the fierce, uncomplicated focus of a child watching something enormous resolve itself. "Does this mean she can stay?" she asked. It was, in the end, the only question that mattered, and it landed in the silent ballroom with more weight than every word that had come before it. Richard looked at his daughter, then at Miriam. "That," he said, "depends entirely on her." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. 3 years lived in that look, the boarding house in Lambeth, the seamstress work that left her fingers raw, the night she had not opened the letter because she could not bear to know what it said, the ballroom 20 minutes earlier where he had looked through her like glass and she had told herself again that she had learned to expect nothing else. And underneath all of it, stubborn and unkillable despite every effort she had made to extinguish it, the thing she had never quite managed to stop feeling. "You said it," she said quietly, "in front of everyone, that you'd never seen me." "I know. That was cruel. I know that too. I am not certain," she said, "that an apology in a ballroom undoes 3 years." "It does not," he agreed. "I am not asking it to. I am asking for the chance to spend considerably longer than one evening trying." Lily, with the perfect, devastating timing of a 5-year-old, chose that moment to take Miriam's face in both her small hands and turn it toward her own. "Please stay," she said. "Please, Mama, please don't go away again." Miriam closed her eyes. When she opened them, there were tears on her face that she did not bother to hide. Not here. Not anymore. Not in front of 200 people who had already seen the worst and most vulnerable version of this story play out across the marble floor of a ballroom. "I am not nobody," she said to Richard very quietly, but in a room gone so silent that every syllable carried. "No," he said, "you never were. I am the worst kind of fool, and I will spend as long as it takes proving to you and to everyone in this room exactly how wrong I was." Lady Cecily Marsh left Hartwell House 20 minutes later, with what dignity could be salvaged, and was engaged to a viscount with considerably less complicated history within the year. She would later describe the evening to her closest friends as the most extraordinary thing she had ever witnessed, and admit, privately, and only after several glasses of wine, that some small part of her had been relieved. The orchestra eventually resumed playing. Nobody danced. Everybody talked. And somewhere in the middle of the ballroom floor, a duke knelt beside a woman the entire room had just watched him publicly deny, and a small girl in a nightgown sat in both their laps, and none of the three of them appeared to notice or care that they were, by any measure London society possessed, the single most scandalous sight any of those 200 witnesses would see that entire decade. It was not, Miriam would think later, the ending she had imagined for this particular evening. It was better. It was also, She understood even as she sat there with her daughter. For that was what Lily was, in every way that mattered, regardless of blood, only the beginning of what would need to be resolved. There was still the matter of the truth. The whole truth. The letter that was not, after all, entirely what it claimed to be. London, the following weeks, November-December 1814. The ballroom emptied slowly that night, in the particular reluctant way of a crowd that has witnessed something it does not yet have the vocabulary to discuss, but is already privately composing the version it will tell tomorrow. Richard did not stay to manage any of it. He sent for his carriage. He wrapped his own coat around Miriam's shoulders. She had left her cloak somewhere near the door in the chaos, and no one had thought to retrieve it, and he carried Lily himself, asleep within minutes of leaving the noise and light behind her, her head heavy on his shoulder, one small hand still fisted in the fabric of Miriam's borrowed coat even in sleep, as though some part of her did not yet trust that the connection would hold without her vigilance. They rode to Grosvenor Square in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have just lived through something too large for words and have not yet found the smaller words required to begin discussing it properly. Miriam looked out the carriage window at London, moving past, gaslit and indifferent, the same city that had held her in obscurity for 3 years, that knew nothing of what had just happened inside Hartwell House, and would know everything about it by tomorrow afternoon. "I have so many questions," she said finally, "that I do not know where to begin." "Begin anywhere," Richard said. "I will answer all of them. I have 3 years of answers I should have given you already." They began, in the end, with the letter. It came out the next morning, in the quiet of the Grosvenor Square library. A different library than the one in Wiltshire, but the choice of room felt deliberate to both of them, a small private acknowledgement of where this had all started. Richard produced 2 documents and set them side by side on the desk. The first was the letter Miriam had carried for 3 years, her father's hand, the seal she had finally broken on the carriage ride home the previous night, unable to bear not knowing any longer what had cost her everything. She had read it by lamplight while Richard sat across from her, saying nothing, simply present, the way she had once taught him to be present for his daughter. The second was a document Richard's secretary had spent 3 days locating, correspondence between her father, Robert Voss, and a solicitor in Edinburgh, dated some 8 years prior, concerning a small inheritance. "Read it," Richard said. Miriam read it. What it revealed, in dry legal language entirely unlike her father's emotional, guilt-soaked confession, was this: Robert Voss's father had not been an anonymous Irish laborer reinventing himself, as the letter Miriam carried claimed. He had been Alastair Cassidy, the younger son of a minor Scottish baronetcy in Ayrshire, a family of modest but entirely legitimate standing, fallen on hard times 2 generations back, who had indeed left for England to seek better fortune, but who had done so as exactly what he was: a baronet's son with a small income and a real, documented, perfectly respectable name. "He was not a fraud," Miriam said slowly. "My grandfather, he was not pretending to be something he wasn't, he simply stopped using a title he had no estate to support." "Your father's letter said otherwise," Richard said quietly. "I had it examined by a man who specializes in such matters, comparing hands, identifying alterations." He turned the original letter toward her and pointed to 4 lines near the bottom, written in ink that was very slightly, almost imperceptibly, different in shade from the rest. "These lines are not your father's hand. They were added afterward, by someone skilled enough that it would take a specialist to notice, and motivated enough to do it anyway." Miriam stared at the 4 lines. "No family connections of any standing. No claim to even the modest respectability you were raised to believe was yours. You are, in every way that matters to the world we live in, nobody." "Your mother," she said. My mother, Richard agreed. She did not invent your circumstances from nothing. She found a true story, a quiet, complicated, slightly embarrassing story about a Scottish family that had let a title lapse rather than maintain it without funds to do so properly, and she sharpened it into something cruel. She did not need to lie entirely. She only needed to lie enough. Miriam sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. 3 years, she said. I believed I was nobody for 3 years because of 4 lines. 3 years, Richard said. I believed you had taken money to abandon us because I wanted an easy answer more than I wanted the true one. He reached across the desk and took the letter gently from her hands, setting it aside. We were both lied to, but only one of us chose to believe the lie because it was convenient. That was me. I will not pretend otherwise to you or to myself ever again. The weeks that followed were not, despite everything, simple. London talked. London always talked, and a duke publicly denying a woman and then publicly kneeling before her, in front of 200 witnesses, with his daughter sobbing the word mama into the silence between them, was precisely the kind of story that London could not stop discussing for an entire winter season. Some of the talk was unkind. Lady Cecily's family, understandably aggrieved, made certain that several uncharitable versions of events circulated in the most fashionable drawing rooms. There were whispers about Miriam's birth, her years as a servant, the impropriety of the entire arrangement, the scandal of a duke's daughter calling a former nursemaid Mama in front of the cream of London society. Miriam heard all of it eventually. She had expected to. What she had not expected was how little it mattered, set against the small, solid fact of Lily's hand in hers each morning, and Richard's steady, deliberate presence beside her at every gathering they chose together to attend, regardless of whose disapproval they might encounter there. You do not have to do this, she told him once, after a particularly frosty evening at the Pemberton townhouse, where 3 matrons had pointedly turned their backs as they entered. You could simply withdraw from society for a season. Let it pass quietly. I spent 3 years letting things pass quietly, Richard said. It cost us everything we had. I find I have no further appetite for quiet. He took her to every event that winter. He introduced her, deliberately by name, to anyone who would receive the introduction. He made it, through sheer persistent visibility, increasingly difficult for London to treat her as a scandal rather than as exactly what she was. The woman the Duke of Ashford intended, openly and without apology, to marry. Slowly the talk changed shape. It always did eventually, when the people at its center simply refused to be ashamed. There was one more conversation that mattered more than any drawing room in London. It happened in the nursery at Ashford Manor, where they returned together in early December, the 3 of them, Richard, Miriam, and Lily, who had not let either of them out of her sight for more than an hour at a stretch since the night of the ball, as though she still feared, somewhere in the unguarded part of herself that children cannot fully reason away, that the separation might happen again if she blinked. Mrs. Greer met them at the servants' entrance. The same entrance, Miriam noted, where she had first arrived 3 years earlier as an anonymous applicant for a position no one had wanted badly enough to fill, and the older woman's face, normally so carefully composed, broke into something unguarded and real. Miss Voss, she said, I told you, did I not? I told you he was not a cruel man. You did, Miriam said. I did not tell you he was a fool, Mrs. Greer added, with the particular dryness she reserved for her most genuine affections, because I had not yet fully appreciated the extent of it. That evening, with Lily finally and reluctantly asleep upstairs, Richard and Miriam sat together in the library. The same chairs, the same fire, the same shelf where a misread book had once cracked open 3 years of careful silence. And he asked her, formally this time, with no mother to forbid it and no lie standing between them, the question he had asked once before in this very room. "I intend to marry you," he said. It was not quite the same words as before. There was less certainty in them now, and more honesty, the certainty of the younger man replaced by something harder one, something that had survived being broken and had to be rebuilt with full knowledge of how badly it could be broken again. "That will cause considerable difficulty," Miriam said, because it was, after everything, still true. "Yes," he agreed, "I am aware. I have rather more practice with the difficulty than I did the first time you said that to me." She looked at him for a long moment. 3 years older than the woman who had sat in this room before, 3 years harder, 3 years more carefully guarded. And she found, when she searched herself for the fear she expected to find, that it was simply not there. It had burned away somewhere on a ballroom floor. In the moment a small girl had run across 200 witnesses to reach her. In the moment a duke had knelt down in front of all of them and told the truth, because the alternative had finally become unbearable. "Yes," she said. It was the same word she had said before. It meant something entirely different now. Not the bright, uncomplicated yes of a woman who had not yet learned what loss cost, but the deeper, steadier yes of a woman who had survived the loss and chosen, with full knowledge of the risk, to return anyway. He kissed her hand, the way he had 3 years before. Then he kissed her properly, which he had not done 3 years before, in this room, with the fire burning and the shelf of books watching and the long Wiltshire night settling quietly around the house that had, after everything, finally found its way back to itself. They were married in February, in the small chapel on the Ashford estate, with only family and the staff who had watched the whole long story unfold in attendance. Mrs. Greer crying without any attempt at composure, the footmen who had once escorted Miriam from a ballroom standing at the back in their best livery, looking considerably more pleased with this assignment than the last one. Lily carried flowers. She had insisted on this with the absolute conviction of a 5-year-old who has decided exactly how a wedding ought to proceed, and no one had found it within themselves to argue with her about it. Society, by spring, had largely moved on to other scandals. There is always another scandal, eventually, and London's attention is a fickle and easily redirected thing. The Duke and Duchess of Ashford were received, in time, with the particular thoroughness that the aristocracy reserves for stories that have resolved themselves into something they can comfortably retell as romantic rather than merely disgraceful. Miriam did not much care by then which version they told. She knew the true one. So did the only two people whose opinion had ever actually mattered. Ashford Manor, Wiltshire, 5 years later, 1819. The library had changed very little. The same shelves, the same fire burning low on a cold evening in early spring, the same chairs by the window, though one of them had been moved, years ago, slightly closer to the other, and had simply stayed there ever since, as though the room itself had quietly accepted the new arrangement and saw no reason to revisit it. Miriam sat in hers with a book open, unread in her lap. She was watching, instead, the scene taking place on the rug before the fire. Lily, now 10, sprawled on her stomach with her chin propped on her hands, deep in argument with her father about whether a particular Latin translation was correct. She had her mother's stubbornness about it, which was to say her asterisk adoptive mother's stubbornness, a distinction that had stopped mattering to any of them so completely that Miriam sometimes had to remind herself it had ever been a distinction at all. Beside Lily, considerably smaller and far less interested in Latin, their second daughter, not yet 2, dark-haired like her sister, with her mother's eyes rather than her father's, was attempting to eat a wooden alphabet tile. "Margaret," Miriam said, without looking up, "not the letters, darling, we discussed this." Margaret removed the tile from her mouth with the deep reluctance of a person who feels she has been denied something essential, considered her options, and threw it at her father instead. It bounced off his shoulder. Richard, mid-sentence about Latin conjugation, did not even pause. "Your daughter has assaulted me," he said to Miriam, without breaking stride in his argument with Lily. "She is your daughter when she misbehaves," Miriam said. "I distinctly remember the terms of our agreement." He looked up at that, across the fire-lit room, the same look he had given her 100 times over 5 years, the one that still, even now, made something in her chest go warm and unguarded. And he smiled the real smile, the one that had once been so rare and now appeared so easily that she sometimes forgot it had ever been otherwise. "I recall no such agreement," he said. "You were not paying attention when we made it. You rarely are, where Margaret's mischief is concerned." "I am paying considerable attention now," he said, and there was something underneath the lightness of it, something that still, after 5 years, carried the particular weight of a man who remembers exactly how easily all of this could have never happened. He said things like that sometimes, small, quiet acknowledgments, dropped into ordinary evenings without warning. Miriam had learned not to deflect them. She had learned instead to simply let them land, because she understood by now that he needed to say them as much as she occasionally needed to hear them. Later, after the children had been carried up to bed, Margaret already asleep against her father's shoulder, Lily walking ahead with the self-important dignity of an eldest child who considers herself far too old to be carried, though she had not, in fact, declined the offer when it was made. Miriam returned alone to the library and stood for a while at the window, looking out at the dark shape of the lime avenue, bare-branched against a clear, star-scattered sky. Richard found her there some time later. He came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and they stood like that for a while without speaking, the way they had learned to do, comfortable in silences that no longer needed filling. "I had a letter today," he said eventually, "from Hartwell. Lord Hartwell is hosting another ball this season. He has specifically requested that we attend." Miriam laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. "Does he? After everything that happened in his ballroom the last time we were there?" "Particularly because of everything that happened in his ballroom the last time we were there," Richard said. "He has informed me, with what I believe was genuine sincerity, that it remains the most talked-about evening Hartwell House has hosted in a decade, and he would consider it a personal favor if we returned to grace the room with our presence once more. He wishes to relive the scandal. He wishes to bask in proximity to it. There is a difference, apparently, though I confess I cannot fully articulate what it is." Miriam turned in his arms to look up at him. "Shall we go?" she asked. He considered this with the particular seriousness he still brought to questions that mattered to her, even 5 years on, even now that so much had been settled and proven, and built into the steady architecture of an ordinary, happy life. "Only," he said, "if you wish to. I find I have very little need to prove anything to that room any longer. I proved what I needed to prove the last time we were in it." "And what was that?" "That I was wrong," he said simply. "That you were never nobody. That I would rather be ruined in front of 200 witnesses than spend one more day pretending I did not know the truth." Miriam was quiet for a moment, her hand resting against his chest, feeling the steady, ordinary rhythm of his heartbeat, the same heart that had once stopped itself so completely, for 2 long years, in service of a story that was never true. "We will go," she said finally, "not to prove anything, simply because I find I no longer mind being looked at in that room or any other." "No," he agreed, drawing her closer, "neither do I." They did attend. That spring, the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, arriving together, unremarkable now in the way that only the most remarkable stories eventually become. Once enough ordinary happiness has accumulated on top of them to soften their sharpest edges. Lord Hartwell greeted them personally at the door, with the particular delight of a host whose ballroom had achieved minor legend status entirely without his planning. The orchestra played, the candles burned, the room glittered exactly as it had glittered 5 years before. And somewhere near that same doorway, though neither of them remarked on it, though perhaps neither of them needed to, because some things settle into a marriage so completely that they no longer require comment. Miriam paused for just a moment, and looked at the spot on the marble floor where she had once knelt, and opened her arms to a small girl running toward her in bare feet. She had been called nobody in this room once. She had also, in this same room, been called Mama, by a child who had not needed a single proof or document or noble bloodline to know exactly who she was. That, in the end, had always been the only truth that mattered. Everything else, the letters, the lies, the carefully constructed cruelties of people who measured worth in bloodlines and bank drafts, had simply been noise, eventually quieted by the much louder, much simpler fact of love that had refused, against every obstacle placed in front of it, to stay buried. The Duke took his wife's hand. The orchestra began a waltz. And this time, when they crossed the floor together, the entire room watched them do it with nothing but warmth. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.